Brilliant. Okay, we'll get started. Amy, did you want to say anything first, or should I just launch straight into it?
Well, I mean, we've had a little bit of an informal chat already, but I was just going to say that, if people were joining us from here in New Zealand or from across the ditch over in Australia, that we were really excited to have everyone join us for a special speaker presentation today. But I think we can probably skip some of those additional pleasantries and let you get on with it.
Kia ora. Oh, kia ora, everybody. I actually think that everybody knows me, which is great, apart from maybe Anna from Wellington, that may or may not have met me before, but I will do the whole introduction anyway. So my name is Renee Santos. I'm an emergency management advisor with Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office, and my role really is when there's not a disaster, I'm out helping the community get prepared and resilient. And when there is a disaster, I'm in the Emergency Operations Centre and I'm helping to coordinate the response with the council. But how I kind of got involved in this work is that I hold the portfolio for the kind of the regional portfolio for accessibility, which sounds a little bit fancier than it really is because it was a role that I kind of created and gave to myself. So, um, but yeah, so I'm also a disabled person. I got into emergency management with this really kind of specific agenda that I wanted to have better outcomes for my community. I'm working on various projects at the moment, but one of them is also sharing a little bit of awareness about inclusive preparedness and planning. So first of all, we'll talk about, what is this disability inclusive preparedness and planning? So at the core of it, it's that people with disabilities receive equivalent and equitable access to information, services, and support. So this disability inclusive planning is the kind of the process, and accessibility is actually the result of this process. There's a few little bits of terminology that I'll talk about. So when I talk about impairment, that's the actual physical side of a disability. Disability is the effect. So people might consider themselves disabled, or they might have an impairment but not consider themselves disabled. It also covers temporary. So you might be temporarily disabled if you've got a broken leg, and kind of situational as well. And I'm sure we've all been on Zoom calls and we're the only person online and we can't hear what people are saying. And that's a little example of kind of situational disability. So I'm going to make some assumptions here, and I'm sure that they are correct, but I'm going to assume that we want to assist affected people. So no one here is heartless. I'm sure no one here would be like, you know what, given the choice, I would actually like disabled people to be disadvantaged, because that's just the kind of person I am. I don't think that there'd be anybody here that would have that kind of feeling. And I also know that if anybody's here family member or themselves became or are disabled, you quickly become an advocate for this as well. We know that we have limited resources and capacity before and after disruption. We know this all too well, and I hope that we try and use those resources to the most effective way possible. So who do we think that this disability inclusive response planning helps? When this is a fictional character, obviously a real person, but a fictional character who we're going to call Raina. So what people often think is, oh, it's just this one person we need to think about. We have to triage our resources. There's a certain amount of helplessness around disability, particularly when it comes to evacuation. It seems too hard. We don't have the resources. We don't have the time. And there is a certain mindset, although people don't vocalize it very often, that is, it's inevitable that some disabled people will die in disaster. They often don't word it like that, but the implication is there. So I guess this planning, what's really important to note is this planning cannot be done in response. So people will die if we have to make these decisions in the heat of the moment, and that's why planning is so important, and I'm going to talk about this quite a lot as well. But when we think about how it helps, actually we've got 650 million people in the world, so 10% of the world have a disability. 1 in 5 in New Zealand and 1 in 6 in Australia identify as disabled. We also have a much, much larger amount of people that will have a functional disability on the day. So I talk about a functional disability or a functional impairment. It's something that limits somebody's ability to perform daily activities. So they might be carrying a baby, for instance. That can be a functional impairment if you have your hands full. They might have lower literacy, age-related impairments, but don't necessarily identify as disabled. They might be in shock. So the number of people that would be having this functional impairment will be a lot higher than the numbers that we kind of see in our statistics. So we're going to put aside moral, ethical, and legal arguments for today. And we're just going to think about why we should commit time and resources to this. Now, I hope when I'm talking about this that I'm preaching to the choir a little bit. But when we think about what are some of those worst case scenarios, worst case, people could lose their lives. And in the better worst case, people experience unnecessary hardship. And it all comes out in the after action reviews anyway. And we have to make these changes anyway, but we're definitely not the good guys in that story or good folks in this story. So if we can embed these considerations now, then it's really going to help us during a response, because people who are disproportionately affected by disruption are also disproportionately represented in our response. So if we're thinking about the time and the energy that it will take to fix something in the moment, why wouldn't we want to direct that time and energy beforehand when things are a lot less stressful? So if there are these things we can do in peacetime that will make our response effective, have fewer issues during recovery for these communities, will build trust, will make our response more equitable, then it's definitely worth it. Like I said, putting aside those moral, ethical arguments about why disabled people have the right to be rescued and all those kinds of things. So I was talking about disruptions have this kind of disproportionate effect. 70% of the people who died in Katrina had access or functional needs, and that wasn't just evacuation resource issues. Part of it was not having access to the information and support that would have allowed them to make good choices earlier. The other part of that was this lack of plans that included disabled people, as well as their real assumptions about their needs and worth, and also assumptions about their quality of life as well. And I have a couple of a bit of a cautionary tale, I guess. So the person in the picture here, his name is Rodney Scott. He's from New Orleans. And when Katrina struck, the staff decided they really need to prioritize evacuating people who could move on their own. And they left several patients as kind of the last priority, including Rodney. So they believed it would be really hard to evacuate him through the hole they had made and to put him onto the helicopter because of his weight and his disability. He was eventually evacuated. He was left in an airport hangar alone for 2 days, and he was the last living person evacuated from the hospital. Meanwhile, between 9 and 20 people were euthanized by doctors in that same hospital, including 61-year-old Emmett Everett, who was a paraplegic man who was actually in the hospital for non-life-threatening surgery. So a series of assumptions were made in that moment during that response, both about the value of disabled lives and also about the feasibility of evacuating disabled people. So I kind of often say that, I don't hold people, I mean, I do in my head, but I don't hold people accountable for the terrible choices they thought they had to make in that moment. But I absolutely hold people accountable for their lack of planning beforehand. And that, I think, is the real kicker there. Oh, I've lost it. There we go. So this is our fictional person, Raina. There's a few things you need to know about her. She uses a power chair. She's a power chair user. Her house is at risk of flooding from incoming weather system. She's arrived at her local community emergency lead centre after an evacuate now text has received on her phone, and she's asking for help. So in your mind, I would like you to think about the kind of questions that you might ask Raina when she's arrived at this community emergency hub or community lead centre. What kind of questions would you ask her? What kind of information would you be wanting to get? A few minutes to think on it and then. So when you think about your questions, I also want you to think about what assumptions you made about Raina. So did you assume that somebody drove her there, that she didn't have her own transport or license, and that she didn't evacuate herself? Did you assume that she lived alone, that she wasn't married, that she didn't support anyone, have children, pets, or support an older parent, that she had brought a carer or a support person with her? Did you assume that she was asking for help for herself and not for a neighbor? And the final assumption I'll ask you about is, did you assume that Raina had come for help and not to get help? So, and not to help, sorry. So had she come for help and not to help herself? So these are the kind of assumptions we make often when we see somebody with a disability. And those assumptions are really colored, I guess, by the model of disability that we hold in our minds. So your initial response to Raina was based on your way of thinking about disability. And the way that we view disability really is really important because it shapes how our emergency response happens, how we create our plans, whether those plans are inclusive or not, and the ways that we respond to people in emergency situations when they're asking for that extra support. So there are a few different models. The first one is the charity, or sometimes called the tragedy model. So it's this poor, disabled, helpless person. We're their savior. We're whisking in, taking them to safety in a helicopter, while at the same time somehow being, grumpy that we have to give them these extra resources. So it often comes from a lack of options, in part because we haven't included people with disability in the pre-planning. We haven't learned about their capabilities, and we haven't provided people with accessible information and tools they need to be really active participants in disaster risk reduction. So under the charity model, we really view people with disabilities as a problem that needs to be managed by us. We often don't manage it very well. By us, I'm talking about CDM, because we think we know all the answers. So an example of this is to advise disabled people to wait for evacuation by emergency services rather than providing the information and tools that they might need to self-evacuate. And some of that comes from those assumptions we were talking before. Another dangerous thing around the charity model is that it creates this kind of learned helplessness or this dependence or perceived dependence that we then need to fill. So we're kind of perpetuating this risk. If we tell people to wait for the emergency services, but we don't have the capacity to come and evacuate everybody, then it perpetuates the risk of people, disabled people, waiting for somebody to come in and help them when maybe they would actually be far better off working on their own evacuation plan. The other model that we're going to talk about here is the medical model. So this is the model that focuses on disabled people as a patient. Similar to the charity model, we're focusing really on vulnerability, but we're honing in on the medical reason why this person is disabled. So we're seeing the person as this collection of medical needs that needs to be fixed. So we're not really considering their strengths or their abilities or their ways of coping in their daily life. So an example I had of this is, let's say we know the number of people who are dependent on oxygen and we know their address. So what does that actually tell us? It doesn't tell us if they have a plan. It doesn't tell us if they have supplies. It doesn't tell us what they really need. So let's say we come in and great, we organize and we drop off oxygen. When we get there, we find that actually they need food. Or we see someone who has a really obvious physical disability during a needs assessment. So we do a deep dive into their medical history, supplying medication, etc. But they're actually looking for their missing child. So when we kind of rush in to focus on fixing this medical condition rather than the actual needs, we make these assumptions that can, be really challenging on both ends. The other model is we're starting to, we're getting a little bit better. We're getting into the social model. So the social model says that these barriers that we have in society lead to poorer outcomes. Now, the way to tell if it's a barrier in society or if it's not, pretty much, is if everybody had this specific disability, how much easier would the world be for them? So, for example, for years and years and years, they told disabled people, including myself, that it would be very difficult to work from home or to work remotely. Impossible. But COVID very quickly showed that if everybody is affected, we can pivot to this remote flexible working. Think of how differently the world would be shaped if everybody was in a wheelchair. So we know that that means that that the barriers that we've put up are societal barriers rather than there being something inherent in the disabled person. So the charitable model kind of says poor you. The medical model says let's fix you. The social model says actually there's nothing wrong with me. It's the barriers in society that are preventing me from full participation. So when our civil defence tools aren't designed with disabled people in mind, this is not necessarily the problem of this disabled person, but a problem with the system. So it changes the question from what's wrong with you that you can't hear our emergency mobile alerts to what's wrong with the emergency mobile alerts that not everyone can hear them. So it's a real shift. There are good things about this because it recognizes that it's not just the disabled person's fault, but it can take away a little bit of some of the disabled person's responsibility and agency, in my mind anyway, because when we start to be like, oh, well, it's a societal problem that needs to be fixed, it means that it's kind of harder to meet in the middle, I guess, in that way, when it'd be like yes, the EMA is broken, but how can we fix it together? So the capability model goes a little bit further, and it talks about that disabled people, and everybody actually, has choices and actions that are either supported or restricted by the availability of resources and the opportunity you have to use those resources to make choices and take actions. So that particular quote, I guess, is from some of the Collaboration for Inclusion work, which I'll send you the link to. They've got some really great awareness training modules. So if we think, how can we have multiple alternate formats and ways to access information so that people can make informed choices about how to receive their information, about what actions they take to put them on, to get that equity between disabled and non-disabled people. So that might be accessible social media, TV, emergency mobile alerts, flyers, all of those kinds of things. So we're talking about the barriers that are in the design of our emergency management plans and our practices that are limiting the options that people with disabilities have. So how can we, through good planning, work with disabled people together in collaboration to reach that middle ground that's better for everyone? So how do we apply this awareness? When we are aware, we can make our response accessible as well. And we make things better for everybody, not just for disabled people. So when we have an accessible sign, we help elderly people with low vision, we help people with low levels of English or literacy, people who have cognitive or neurological disabilities, people who are under extreme stress as a result of the disaster and need that reduced kind of cognitive load on them, and people who have urgent needs and just need to find the right place quickly. Some of these examples of this. So the first example I have here, this is a deliberately bad example. So what we have here is a sign that we're going to say is in an emergency assistance centre or welfare centre, depending on where you are. So here we have low contrast. We've got a italic serif font, so lots of little twiddly bits on it. We've got a graphic above text. We've got a very vague graphic here, if anyone can figure out what that is. I think it's meant to be a police light flashing. We've also got jargon and non-precise language. We've got capital letters and the font is too small. So what you're actually seeing here is this. So this sign, yeah, and everyone goes, ah, yeah, exactly. So this sign conveys the same information as the previous sign, just in a lot more accessible format. So I have information and resources that I'll send out after this that talks about kind of what the criteria, I guess, is for accessibility, so you can go through and check. And I've got some accessibility considerations as well. So obviously there's some great things about this one. Missing persons, plain language. It's a reading level of 8th grade or below, and I talk a little bit about that in the materials as well. High, large font, easy to read. It's got high contrast. We have a picture that is hopefully a lot less vague. Still might not be perfect, but hopefully a lot less vague. So when I talk about these ones, I talk about, sign doesn't seem like life and death, but it could mean a delay in getting help and kind of unnecessarily stress, time and effort and resources as well. So if we have someone who hasn't been able to report their family member missing because they didn't know what the inquiry sign meant, that becomes a really big deal. Also, I want to say that a lot of the people that I mentioned when I was talking about was, are used to living their life, not necessarily making a fuss, thinking somebody else needs more help, or maybe being scared to bother people if they're not being understood. And they're used to getting on with it and making do. So we want to make it as easy as possible for people to ask for help. We want to reduce as many of those barriers as we possibly can. So another example I had as well, there was a report of a deaf man at a shelter that had audio announcements. This was in America. He didn't know that the food was free, so he didn't eat for 3 days and he went into diabetic shock. He did survive though. It sounds crazy, right? And some people would say, oh, surely that's not that's on him for not, asking somebody. But people were stressed, the environment is chaotic, people don't necessarily have time. He's scared to approach people. Maybe some people were scared of the sounds that deaf people make as well. He's worried about the legal consequences of eating food if he can't pay. Maybe he tried to communicate with someone and had a negative experience, or maybe he just didn't understand, so he sat in the corner and made do. So the signage and the accessibility things I'm talking about are based on evidence. And in my mind, it doesn't matter what people should do, it matters what people actually do. And on the whole, what we've seen is that disabled people are less likely to kind of make a fuss or draw attention to themselves or put themselves out there because they're used to that. They're used to adapting in their daily life. So when we talk about some of the things we can do, so working on yourself first, so become informed, challenge your own assumptions. Some of the ideas that we have, some of these assumptions are that we should always evacuate disabled people last, that we should leave mobility devices behind, that we should do the greatest good for the most people. So these kind of spoken and unspoken rules in emergency management were often put in place when disabled people's lives were considered less, and they actually haven't really been thought about since. A lot of these ideas carry over from a really long time ago. So the challenge is to reassess what is true and what is just the way it's always been done. So there's a real interesting one about evacuating disabled people last. Who is in a better position to evacuate themselves from a building in the dark than somebody who is blind? It seems crazy to me that you would ask a blind person to stand at the top of the stairs and wait until they're evacuated by a sighted person, right? And there's actually another story that was from 9/11 as well, of a blind person who had a guide dog called Rosie that actually evacuated a lot of people from the towers because they were able to navigate in situations where other people couldn't. This leaving mobility devices behind as well, that things are too bulky to take with you, that they're not a necessity or that they're a nice to have. So you can take somebody from having that kind of relative mobility to take away their mobility device. You can exacerbate their disability by by quite a lot, right? And then this has flow-on effects for the whole rest of that person's response. You've taken them from a position of ability and you've made them more disabled by the actions that you've done, which obviously goes into recovery as well. And I'm particularly talking about the heavier items like power chairs and things like that as well, and the effect that that would have on somebody if you took away their power chair. We talk about do the greatest good for the most people, but I flip that on its head and I talk about the right to be rescued. So there is an acceptance of this kind of notion that emergency planning requires prioritizing some lives over others. And this myth of kind of focusing resources on the most people, when I would say you should focus your resources, in my mind, on the most severe outcome. So if you've got 100 people who can evacuate and one person who can't, who do you help? Why would you help the 100 people when you can help that person that is most likely to have the most severe outcome? Why would you treat a person with a spinal injury any different whether it happened 2 hours ago or 2 years ago? So if someone was injured in an emergency, you often see, there will be there'll be a lot of, stretchers and evacuating and everything else. But if someone is in a power chair, they're not necessarily treated the same way compared to an injured person. I talked as well around awareness. So there are some key markers that will indicate if you kind of know what you're talking about. So if you know what model of disability you're using and you've identified some of those internal biases you might have, do you know the history of using the word disabled people versus people with disabilities? I'm going to send you some resources around that. Do you, knowing that not all people who are disabled identify as disabled? And thinking as well really carefully, what's your tone of voice when you're speaking to disabled people as well? That can also be a kind of a one to think about the next time you're talking to a disabled person, just being aware of the tone of voice and the way you're using. It's often, people often slip into this kind of inadvertently into this tone of voice of speaking to children. Now, I've got some resources after the session. You don't have to be an expert in this stuff, but a little bit of understanding goes a long way. And like I said, I've got a ton of resources to help you with that. So I've got some of these top tips as well around kind of partnership and participation. So when you're building those relationships, it's really important to identify local disabled champions and to know the history of engagement before you go in. Letting those disabled voices take the lead and facilitating opportunities for disabled people to get together and plan, even if you are not the center of that, even if you're just facilitating that meeting. Disabled people, including myself, are used to the wheel being reinvented a lot and the same conversations happening. You'll go through this whole process and then someone new will come in and then you'll end up going through the whole process all over again. So that can be a little bit frustrating as well. Pay people fairly for their time. Disabled people are often underemployed, but somehow also expected to volunteer or accept less pay. And I think perhaps this is my more radical side showing, but the irony of someone on, who's on a 200K a year salary arguing about $50 for a disability consult to pay a disabled person can sometimes also be a bit on the nose. And when we talk about action, so go where they are. What local groups can you call on? Can you go where disabled people meet and bring your conversations to them rather than expecting them to come to you? At the end of every chat, I also ask, who else should I be speaking to? Who else would you recommend? And partnership starts at the beginning and not at the end. So it often happens that a product is created and they come in and it's not really partnership, it's more of a consult. And even then, it's not even a consult in that, what's the best way to put this? It's not even a consult that like a true consult. It's more like, hey, look at this great thing I created. You like it, right? It's good, right? I did good, right? And so expected to be like, oh yeah, it's great. And then your box is ticked and away you go. But by bringing people in at the beginning, you can feel like it's that true collaboration. And again, the saying that people often use is nothing about us without us. So nothing that is involving us or our ideas or our thoughts without us at the beginning of it. Talk about commit as well. So don't leave people hanging. Don't get involvement at the beginning and then they never hear from you again. They wonder, oh, whatever happened with that thing that we thought was happening that you came and talked to us about. Making sure that communication is really good. I talked before about not asking people to help you reinvent the wheel. It might be brand new to you, but this might be, you know, the third or fourth person in the cycle the last 10 years that have come to ask them to do the same thing. And accessibility conversations as well. These are not a one-time thing. This is not a one and done. This is something that really continues on over time. That's when you get that true engagement. So something I say as well is progress over perfection. So we deserve perfection, but we'll have to settle for progress at the moment. It's a huge topic. It's often overwhelming, accessibility. So try and make those small, easy wins first. Break it down into really specific, achievable outcomes, actions that you can improve. It's far better to have something small completed than something too big that will eventually get put in the hard basket, right? So thinking, what is the smallest thing that I can do and get across the line that will improve the accessibility of my organization, of my response, of wherever you're at the moment. Also, don't save accessibility for special occasions. Try to embed accessibility considerations into the fabric of your work program, whatever that work program might be. Really challenge people to think how they can make something more accessible or consider disabled people, even if the topic is not specifically on accessibility. And I've seen that real change happens when accessibility is embedded across the organization, so it just becomes natural when you don't have one person championing it, but you have a whole of the organization understanding and championing it. So I will stop sharing. It was a lot of information in a short amount of time, but I am absolutely happy to take any questions or anything or comments or any ideas that people might have.
Small group, welcome to just take yourself off mute and jump right in if you want, ladies.
Can I just double check that I heard correctly? Because I was making notes and I'm like, what? When you said at the beginning, what percentage of fatalities in Hurricane Katrina were people with disability? Did you say 70%?
70% of casualties in Hurricane Katrina had some kind of functional need. Yeah, functional or access need.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's the same. I've seen it in almost every, I don't think there's a single response where I haven't seen disabled people disproportionately affected. And like I said as well, a lot of it comes from a lack of information, like I talked about, and also a lack of response planning and a lack of including excluding disabled people in that planning process. It's a horrifying number, isn't it?
That is staggering to me. Yeah, it sort of took me so I'm writing it down and going, I have to check that because I am not sure that I wrote that down correctly, because wow.
So, Renee, where do you think the biggest, not bang for the buck, but if people are starting on this journey in the emergency management space, where would you start? Where did you start?
Yeah, I think firstly with my own awareness, I think that was probably the first step I took, was to make sure that I was really aware so that I could help support others. It helped that I had that lived experience. It helped me engage with the disability community as well, having that lived experience. But I started to think about what some of my I guess what were the biases that I was seeing and experiencing. And then I started with digital accessibility, and I looked at what were the changes that I could make to make sure that people had the information that they needed. But really, you can pretty much start. With accessibility, you can pretty much start anywhere. And just what I suggest to people is, like I said, just pick that one thing that you're going to get across the line and follow it through to completion, and then pick the next thing. Sorry, I got a bit of sore throat. I think that the response planning side of it is really important as well. So having that lens on, that accessibility lens into every aspect of response, and what are those considerations, and how can I make this better for disabled people, particularly in the planning, and also when you're exercising as well, like how we do our exercises as well. What is the aspect of this that we can make better for disabled people? Excuse me.
I have a question for you, Renee. I quite liked the example that you gave us with Rena, with your fictional character. Is that something that you explore a bit further in other sessions that you do, where you maybe have a little bit more time and you get people to go beyond that first round of questions?
Yeah, so in a face-to-face session, we'd normally have a bit of time to kind of pick that apart, and where those biases are coming from, and why we might have made the assumptions that we did. And we would also look at we would look more at that strength-based model around what are the strengths and capabilities that Raina would have in the response that would make her a really valuable asset to the response, not just as someone who needs help. People with disabilities we navigate in a world that's not made for us all the time. We're having to adapt and be emergency managers in our own life every single day, and that some of those skills also make us uniquely placed to be really good at response, and really good at leadership and advocacy and all kinds of stuff. So a lot of strengths that we can bring, including knowledge as well. If you want to know what forms of accessible transport, if you're on the logistics desk and want to know all about accessible transport, then and ask somebody who has to navigate that world every day.
Any other questions for Renee? I do have a comment from Anna, who said she's not feeling particularly well, so not going to speak, but we did want to pass along a message that this has been a really great talk and presentation, and she's enjoyed it.
Oh, brilliant. Thank you. Yeah, we covered a lot in a short amount of time. Actually, I looked at the time and I thought, oh my goodness, did I do all of that in half an hour? I probably could have, how it is online, but could have slowed it down a bit. But yeah, no, it was great to be able to share this. And I think the value comes as well is that I am going to, thanks Vivian, I am going to send you out a whole lot of resources where you can look through some of the stuff in your own time, and that might also trigger some of your thinking as well of how you can embed this into whatever area you are doing. Like I said, accessibility covers pretty much every single aspect of life and jobs, so there'll always be some area that you can incorporate it into. And I'll send out the slides as well.
Will this, I noticed that we were recording, is this going to be available to people later on? Like, I wouldn't mind flipping a link through to my enablers network in my organization, just to say, really good thing. I think everyone should have a listen,
Yeah, I'm more than happy for Amy to share the link to it. That's not a problem.
Yeah, so I didn't do the normal spiel that I do with most presentations at the start about the Australasian Women in Emergencies Network, but because we are recording this today, it'll probably take me about a day, but I will save it and put it on the On Network YouTube channel, and then I'll, if all of you registered and got the link to today's session through Humanitics, what I can do is also send the resources from Renee and the link to the recording out together, probably either tomorrow afternoon or Friday, but
Yeah,
that way you
that's
can share it to people, and if it's somebody who's interested in our field, you can encourage them to join and share and, continue the work in the mahi that we're doing here.
And anyone who is watching this in Australia, you have an incredible resource over there in Collaborating for Inclusion, and in Michelle at the University of Sydney. She's done a lot of work in disability inclusive emergency planning and response. So I'll send those links as well. You're very lucky to have her over there.
Well, I think we're very lucky to have you over here too, Renee. Working, alongside you. Oh, I know, working alongside you. I've learnt a lot already, and and outside of this, and this has been really great just to kind of challenge thinking, and that idea of being, that of the functional, the third one, whatever, that actually they're not people who I'd thought about when we're having this conversation, and so that's really helpful as well. And that bit to that kind of that think from the capability. I mean, I just had lunch with my friend who's in a power wheelchair on Sunday, and she talks just some of her daily everyday challenges. She had to wait out in the wind for an hour for the wheelchair taxi to collect her from Eastbourne to bring her to Wellington. She lives in Dunedin, and it's like, and she couldn't go back to where she was because she was staying with a friend, and people had to carry her wheelchair and her up the stairs and down the stairs. So, which isn't really the most gracious thing, but it enabled her to have a cool night out. But all I'm saying is, like, it's not okay to wait an hour in the cold. If you're able-bodied, it's not that great, and if you're not, it's not at all. But you know but certainly she's the person who would help in an emergency rather than need anything in an emergency. So nice to challenge that kind of thinking. So thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And I also talk about as well is that these barriers that are put in place are ones that we have created, and therefore if the benefit of that is if they're things that we've created, they're also things that we can remove as well. So I talk a little bit about not just maintaining the safety, I guess, but also the dignity of people of disabled people. When we talk about evacuation and you end up on the back of a flatbed truck because nobody investigated accessible transport, it's like we can do this, but this comes in the planning stage. We can't do it during a disaster. It's too hard and we don't have enough resources, but we can do it beforehand. So that's what needs to happen. We need to do that planning, do that thinking beforehand, so that we can make sure that situations like your friend experience and like people have experienced before, so we can reduce the likelihood of that happening. Cool.
Thank you, Renee. Any final questions or comments for her before we close for this evening? I think, like you said, Renee, a lot of material to cover and to digest and to kind of take away with us. So thank you for giving your time tonight and for those resources in advance. So really appreciate tonight's session.
No worries. It's just this is just the first little tiny fingernail dip in the gigantic sea that is accessibility. So I hope this encourages people to take that next step.
Right. Thank you all for coming tonight. And yeah, like I said, we will get this session put up on the all YouTube channel, and we'll make sure that we share those resources out. So good to see everyone tonight.
Cool. Kia ora, everyone.
Thank you all. See you later. Ka kite.
Thanks, Deborah. See you later.
No.